Before we start now, I just wanted to briefly introduce our two speakers. We have Linda Kinstler, who is a contributing writer to the Economist 1843 magazine and a PhD candidate in the Rhetoric Department at UC Berkeley. Her work also appears in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, Wired, and others. Before her current work, she was the managing editor at the New Republic, where she covered the war in Ukraine. Our commentator on Linda's talk is Itamar Mann. He is a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa. Prior to coming to Haifa, Itamar was a National Security Law Fellow at Georgetown Law Center. He holds GSD and LLM degrees from Yale Law School. Itamar's research and teaching interests are in international law and environmental law and legal theory. Since 2021, he is the president of the Geneva-based organization Border Forensics. Lastly, and because it is related to the topic and today's talk, I just wanted to point out the chapter Itamar wrote, Hangman's Perspective, 3 genres of critique following Eichmann, that was published in the Oxford Handbook of International Criminal Law. In it, he identified 3 perspectives for thinking and criticizing mass atrocity trials. And I think the best I can do now is to leave the floor to Linda to start the presentation.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that lovely introduction. And that paper that you just mentioned that Itamar wrote was extremely, inspiring to me as I was starting to write the book. And it was actually a mutual friend and scholar, Lindsay Stonebridge, who has also written about the relationship between the Eichmann trial and different kinds of modes and imagination of justice, as well as Nuremberg. And she has amazing scholarship on both of those trials that directed me to Itamar's work. So I'm grateful to her for that. And so all of these things will come up in what follows. But for now, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see this? Hold on. Resume share. Can you see the screen?
Not yet. Yeah, you can.
Oh,
Wait.
Okay, let's try this again. Okay.
Yes.
Here we go. Great. So this is, I will start just very informally to kind of give everyone who hasn't read the book a kind of sense of what it's about and what the project is. So it's called Come to This Court and Cry. The title is a reference to one of the closing speeches at Nuremberg, which we will get to later. The subtitle is How the Holocaust Ends. And the picture that you see on the cover is of the subject of the book, whose name was Herbert Suckers. He was a very well-known person in Latvia during the interwar period, during the country's kind of first abbreviated bout of independence. He was known as the Latvian Lindbergh because he was an aviator and he flew all over the world during this kind of initial moment when it became possible to fly long distances and when newspapers were tracking the journeys of these early aviators all over the world. And so that's why his face was so well known. And he was decorated as a hero for his flights. And because he was so, famous, his face later during World War II, he joined what was called the RS Commando, which was one of the most brutal killing units of the Holocaust in Latvia. And his victims were, in many cases, personally familiar with him from before the war. And so they were able to recognize his face, which is extremely kind of important as we're thinking about what their testimonies said. So this image, the reason why it's the cover is because it's a surveillance photograph taken of Herbert Suckers in 1949 after he fled to Brazil with his family. He lived in the open and he never, felt that he had to occlude his identity because he didn't feel he had done anything wrong. And this photograph is in the Yad Vashem archives It was passed between these organizations of Jewish survivors who were trying to who took it upon themselves to track down perpetrators in the period after the war, when it still seemed possible that there would be a series of trials after Nuremberg. So there was kind of this effort on behalf of the British called the Riga Ghetto Trial. They had all of these men in custody immediately after the war and ended up releasing some of them and transferring some of them to German custody. And that trial never ended up happening. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's a kind of general background. So here are just some maps that open the book that should kind of familiarize you with the region that I'm focusing on. Riga is kind of like right here. And this kind of just shows you the way that the front lines shifted from during the war and how Latvia was configured during its period of independence. This is Cukurs during his kind of height in the 1920s and 30s. You can see how he was photographed. This is from one of the Latvian newspapers. And this is a photo of the Arais Commando. Victor's Arais is this guy, seated right here in the front row. This is Walter Stahlecker, who was one of the German kind of leaders of the unit. Part of the reason that I wrote this book is because, you know, my grandfather on my father's side was also a member of the Arais Commando. And we are not sure if he's in this photo, but there's some reason to believe that he's this guy seated right here. But we don't have any confirmation of that. He disappeared after World War II. He went to work for the KGB at some point, and so we don't know very much about his life. He never met my father because he disappeared before he was born. We only have records of his service in the Arais Commando, where he is said to have worked as a scribe. He, there's a paper in which he signs off on the allocation of rifles to individual members, including Arais and Cukurs. And there's some documents in which he requests some cigarettes for the men. And then we have his KGB registration numbers and some interrogation protocols about his activities, both for the commando and for the KGB after the war. And, you know, when I was growing up, I grew up with my mother's Jewish family. So I was raised in the Jewish tradition and given a Jewish education, and only learned about this part of the family story quite late in life, after I had already begun studying the history of the Eichmann trial in school. So for me, this is kind of the most difficult part of the story, and it's something that needs to be said as I explain my own involvement here. It's certainly my way into this story, but it's not the reason why I find this to be a compelling story. So, and you can see this, the numbers are from a Soviet archive, because obviously when the Soviets took over Latvia, they were the ones who immediately collected all the documentation, and also the kind of Soviet Special Committee collected a lot of the immediate evidence while the war was still ongoing of their crimes. This is another surveillance photograph of Herbert Cukurs from after the war. This is from the Wiener Library Archive. You can see very clearly the kind of urgency in which they were trying to track him down and bring him to justice. And then this is kind of the moment where the story really starts, and where I think it becomes really a legal story. So this is a 1965 series of press clippings This one on the left is from a Brazilian paper reporting on his murder, and this one on the right is from a Latvian paper. So the first thing that I will say is that we all know the story of the Eichmann trial and the kidnapping. And when I discovered this case of Herbert Zuckers, I thought it was a very strange successor to the Eichmann case. And I didn't understand how, we think of the Eichmann trial as this kind of world historical event that we interrogate for what it means for the legacies of justice, for the kinds of, vengeance and testimony that it revealed. But this case is very similar and seemed to have traveled under the radar in some ways. So the first thing I will say is also that the Yaakov Medad was an Israeli security agent who was one of the kidnappers of Adolf Eichmann in 1960. And I'm not going to go into the details of that mission here, but he was kind of one of the central players in that mission, and it was obviously a huge success. And when he returned to Israel, a few years later, he was given a new mission and a new target. And now we see, and it was Zuckers. And so all of these surveillance photographs that I've shown you were being sent to Israeli authorities and to Jewish organizations, of course, to try to track him down. And so at some point there was a mission was formed to murder Zuckers. And one of the questions that I ask in this book is whether indeed they meant to murder him from the start, or if it was supposed to be a kidnapping akin to that of Eichmann. And it's also kind of in the newspaper coverage, you can see there are rumors that Zuckers is going to be the Soviet Eichmann, that there were these kinds of imaginations that there might be, that the Soviets wanted their own version of this trial to show that they were holding these perpetrators to account. So what happened was Yaakov Medad traveled to Brazil under the pseudonym Anton Kunzle. He befriended Zuckers, posed as an Austrian businessman, and eventually, after months of correspondence and interaction, lured him to this bungalow in a place called Shangri-La, off of the coast of Montevideo, where other Mossad agents were waiting inside of the house, and they killed him and left his body in this trunk. And so you can see this is when the Uruguayan police showed up to the crime scene. You can see the blood pooling here below. So what happened here, basically, is the first question. So on his body, there was a folder left behind. And the folder contained the closing speech of Sir Hartley Shawcross at the Nuremberg trial in 1945. And that speech focused overwhelmingly on crimes committed on the territory of what is now Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltics, because at the time when the Nuremberg trials were occurring, when this first trial was occurring, that was the evidence that was available at the time, because the Soviets had collected it and because these territories had been taken over again. So he was speaking specifically about Einsatzgruppe A, which is what the Reichskommando belonged to. And he ends his speech by asking the judges very directly. He says, imagine that all of humanity stands before you and comes to this court and cries, these are our laws, let them prevail. And so that's where the title comes from, comes to this court and cry, because it's kind of this, reference to what it means to stand before a courtroom and ask the laws to prevail, and also kind of this lament that whatever way in which justice is delivered or in which the law prevails, there will always be something lost, right? There's always some remainder. So that was left on the body of Herbert Zuckers. Now, on the right, some accounts of this murder say that that this sentence actually was left on the body, which is not true. It was the speech of Sir Hartley Shawcross. what happened was after the assassins left the country, they fled to Argentina first and then back to Israel. They had a problem, which is that no one noticed that he had been killed except for his family, who couldn't get in touch with him. And so what they did was they called the bureaus of AP and Reuters in Germany. And they sent this telegram and they said, "Did you get our letter?" And at first the reporters ignored them. They thought it was a hoax. And only after the second call did they say, "Okay, maybe let's look into this." And what's interesting here, I think, some people before the talk started might have heard me say, the legal theory element of the story is what is most interesting to me. The way in which the Nuremberg trial and the Eichmann trial appear to be kind of obvious precursors to the Zucker's case and the kind of recursive logic that we see at work here. So you see that the agents have pronounced a sentence. They're acting as judges, taking into consideration the gravity of the charge leveled against the accused, Zuckers, namely that he personally supervised the killing of more than 30,000 men, women, and children, and taking into account the fact that the accused of his own free will engaged himself in such tasks at the time when he had an honorable profession in which he could have continued working throughout the German occupation of his country. And finally, considering the extreme display of cruelty which the subject allowed when carrying out his tasks, the accused, Zuckers Herberts, is hereby sentenced to death. Implementation of sentence, and then a PS to the editor. Please excuse the way the above is presented to you. We have chosen this way for security reasons, and you certainly will understand it. So it's a strange kind of telegram to receive. And elsewhere, there's a memoir by Yaakov Medad in which he says we had planned a court-martial. So they had planned to have this kind of ad hoc proceeding, but they didn't have a chance because Zuckers reached for his gun. So they had to murder him immediately. So this sentence for me is like, I'm not really interested in the facts of the assassination, but rather by the kinds of justice that it was attempting to secure. Obviously, by murdering him, they were kind of wanted to give him the ultimate punishment for what he had done. But as we will see, it ended up kind of opening up his story and making him, a kind of martyr. So one thing I will mention, just to underscore the connection between the Eichmann trial and the Zuckers case, is that this is one of the witnesses, Eliezer Karstadt, who was a survivor of the Riga ghetto and of several concentration camps in Latvia, who testified at the Eichmann trial and spoke Zuckers' name into the record and said that he was living in Brazil. So this is, one of the most important testimonies that we have about Zuckers' crimes. So I'll just leave that there. And here, this is really the reason why I wrote the book. This is from a Latvian, one of the biggest Latvian kind of online news outlets, and it says, the prosecutor is still investigating whether Zuckers is culpable in the murders of Jews. And so what does this mean? I discovered in 2015 that when I was a graduate student at Cambridge, that the Latvian Prosecutor General's office was actively investigating Zuckers for what he had done while he was in the RS Commando. And it seemed to me a very strange case because it was a pretrial investigation, right? It hadn't gone to trial. They were just obligated to investigate him because there were allegations that he had committed or participated in war crimes. Obviously, he had been dead at that point for 60 years, so you couldn't put the corpse on trial, but you could kind of look at all the available evidence. And I approached the prosecutor around this time and asked, about the circumstances of the case. And he said, I'm going to all these governments that are involved, to the Israelis and the Germans, the Americans and the Uruguayans and the Brazilians, the British, and asking for all of the evidence that they have so that I can make my verdict, or rather decision. And the decision would be whether you can say, whether he could be said to, whether Zuckers could be said to have participated in these crimes, right? And for historians, I will say this is not an open matter. For historians, it's incontrovertible that he belonged to the Kommando. And in Germany, for instance, where belonging to a unit is all you need to prove guilt, that is sufficient. But Latvia doesn't have a corresponding law, partly because of the Soviet legacy, because only in 1991 did it acquire kind of real judicial independence. So I learned that this case was ongoing. I talked to the prosecutor, and then in 2018, this is an English translation of the decision, the first ruling came down. And you can see the kind of language in which it was issued. Very interestingly, it says they don't know why this specific criminal proceeding was even begun. But ultimately, the prosecutor decided the evidence is not sufficient. And in this document, which I think is a truly fascinating document, all of the testimonies, including that of Eliezer Karstadt, are referenced. And many of the witnesses who are cited are no longer living, and so they cannot be called to testify, which makes their statements much easier to impugn, which is kind of one of the central epistemological problems that I find myself contending with while following the story. And basically what happened was, after this decision came down, the Jewish community of Riga said this is a scandalous decision and appealed immediately and said, no, you haven't adequately considered all the evidence. Here's some additional testimonies, and began looking for living survivors and descendants who could testify to the court, who could submit their affidavits. And they appealed. The appeal was rejected once, and then they appealed again, and it was accepted. And so the case remains open. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone again. So I just, in the book, I talk a lot about the kind of legal theoretical implications of this case that remains open and kind of, in abatement, right? It's a case in which, I write about Kafka in the book, but in like how, the beginning of it is unknown, the ending of it is unknown, and what form of justice it could deliver is also kind of up for debate. And in my mind, it is emblematic of this reaching of law back into history, right? Because we've cultivated this, I don't want to say forensic, but almost kind of forensic desire to be able to pin down exactly what happened in the distant past, which I think a lot of us will be familiar with from having followed the recent controversy over the supposed betrayer of Anne Frank. So the courts are reaching back further and further into history. The historians who have already come to have methods and have come to conclusions about these stories are asked to come before them and justify their findings. And it's that kind of conflict that I saw unfolding and tried to interrogate in my own way. So I will stop there, and I apologize for my dog, and let Itamar respond, and then we can talk some more.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Linda, for this insightful talk. I will give immediately the floor to Itamar for his comment, and then following the comment, we will open the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So first, I want to say that this is a wildly fascinating book, and the plot line is really grasped me, and I think it's really worth your attention as people who are interested in the theory of criminal law. And I want to offer some kind of reflections on what I think is revealed or suggested in terms of theory of criminal law in the book. I think these reflections are kind of preliminary, and they're set as really questions for our conversation after I finish. I want to kind of think things that I want to hear Linda speak a little bit more about. But before I really get into things, I wanted also to say thank you for being part of this and for having an opportunity to respond to this very, very fascinating book. Okay, so as I was reading the book and reflecting on Yosef Yerushalmi's quotation that serves as a kind of theme or motto that reappears in various parts of the book, is it possible that the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice? I was reminded of the final scene of a film that some of you may remember, Inglourious Bastards, 2009, Quentin Tarantino. And I'll remind you what happens there, more or less. So Hans Landa, who's the Nazi character on the right side of the screen, reaches an agreement with Aldo Reine, who's Brad Pitt here on the more left side of the screen, who is a Nazi hunter set to revenge for the Holocaust crimes. And this is a kind of like a plea bargain or a state, a government protected witness agreement. They agree that Landa will be protected and sent back to the United States, and in return will give evidence, information that Aldo Reine will use to further hunt Hitler. And so when they do kind of implement the agreement, you see Brad Pitt being released here for that reason. And then the next scene is that Brad Pitt or Aldo Reine decides to shoot Landa's friend, another Nazi who was with him. And they decide to then, and Landa really is very, very upset. You have violated our agreement. We had an agreement. This is a deal is a deal. But nonetheless, they decide to carve a swastika on his forehead for the purpose of never forgetting who Landa is. He's being asked, when you live on your nice island in Nantucket, you will lose this uniform. So I think I want to contribute to you something that you will not be able to lose, not forget. So reflecting on the book, and I'll soon explain why this was, I think, related to the book. I want to suggest that this is a kind of model for justice after mass atrocity. There's an enormous urge for revenge, but in order to count as justice, revenge needs to be given a certain form of legality or really a resemblance to legality, which in this case is the agreement. Once these two people agree, they reach a deal, there is a kind of pacta sunt servanda logic between them, and they are members of a certain kind of community that has win-win situations between them. But then that doesn't allow for the conditions of justice against the kind of mass atrocity to be realized, and therefore the need to violate the deal, but to violate it in a way that doesn't violate it directly. They're not killing him. He can allegedly remain secure, but to violate it in a way that will leave some form of justice in the background. Now, I want to say that both the Eichmann trial and the Zucker's assassination have these basic formal characteristics. But while the Eichmann trial touches upon the violence, the uncontrolled illegal revenge from the outside, and it seems to us to be firmly located in the site of legality. The Sukurs event that really follows on its tail historically is on the other side of the screen, on the other side of the curtain, as it were. It's mainly, it appears mainly as an act of assassination, but then it has this sentence and quotation from Hartley Shawcross on the body that gives this very, very, very minimal, granted, resemblance of something that is being done in order to achieve justice. In the screen here, you see a plan for the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in Beit Ha'am with the words Sodi, Sodi on the bottom side. This is a secret. This is during the preparation. It's a classified document. And we know that the Eichmann trial was, very controversial on its side of legality in terms of just the kidnapping from Argentina, violating Argentina's sovereignty, and all, and the fact that that kind of illegality was required as a basic condition in order for the trial to pursue. And in a way, it remained in the ultimate result, even though we do understand it, as Linda said in her remarks earlier, as this kind of world trial, an example of what international legality and international justice can be. And for Sukurs, I don't think I necessarily need his photograph right now after Linda's presentation, but for Sukurs, as I said, really, it's just the mirror image. It's just the mirror image. It kind of disappears from history, and it remains in this kind of shadowland of Mossad operations to assassinate people. But it's clear that it's also, in a way, understood as part of this continuum. There are two separate poles on one continuum in my mind. And I want to say here that there is very interesting research on the relationship between this problem of this continuum between assassination and justice in the international sphere in the context of targeted killings. So there's a very good book on in the context of war and anti-terrorism acts. There's a very good book by a scholar named Marcus Gunaflu, who traces the development of the legal doctrine of targeted killing from Israeli military contexts to the Obama era, but its prehistory is in simple revenge actions by paramilitary groups around 1948. And he shows the kind of continuum between this very legalized violence and this kind of very, rudimentary act of revenge among different combatant groups. So here, with the context of the trial, there is this kind of similar, I think, dynamic. And in a way, this is a familiar theme in legal theory. This is a really classical text that I think that maybe most of us in this virtual room have come across, Violence in the Word by Robert Cover. I think this is the main, the most paradigmatic text that tries to capture this kind of continuum that always exists with every act of legality, and especially in the context of criminal law, where it never, finally or ultimately detaches itself from the violence that is behind it, and that violence always remains a condition. And in that regard, we can see the two trials as well on a kind of continuum. But then the second half of the book, all this happens in the first half of the book, really. But the second half of the book really focuses on this very mind-boggling trial to find whether Sukurs is responsible for these crimes posthumously. So they're trying, the defendant is a dead body, is a corpse, as Linda writes. And in a way, she tells us also this, that this is a political trial. So I want to say there's another continuum here, and she compares quite explicitly this political trial in Latvia to the Eichmann trial. And both in a way, so she says at some point in the book that the shadow of the world historical trial is behind this posthumous trial in which they're trying to find whether indeed these clearly historically valid accusations have indeed happened. And so here, I think the continuum is different, whereby in one case, Israeli society is trying to define itself, is trying to assert its independence through the punishment of Eichmann. And in a very kind of sad and cruel turn of political events that Linda traces, it appears that the Latvian society is also politically trying to define its independence, its national identity, through clearing his record, and indeed portraying him as this kind of martyr, that, to use your words. And it's very interesting to see that this is built on these rehabilitation trials from the Soviet era, and the rehabilitation trials that were targeted were supposed to clear the record of people who were suspected of acting against Soviet Russia, are now turned into these posthumous exoneration trials that have to do with clearing someone of their Nazi past, essentially. But as I said, another continuum between the Eichmann trial and the Latvian trial, first between the Eichmann trial and the assassination. Okay, and in all of these contexts, and especially in this context where the assassination somehow prepares the conditions for another nation defining itself in the martyrdom of this war criminal, we see that, going back to Yerushalmi's quotation, remembering remains. So nothing is really forgotten when the Holocaust ends, but the memory is in a way functioning against the cause of justice, I think, or in a way that forwards injustice instead of forwarding justice. And here I want to invite Linda to expand on that and explain to us if that's really what she meant. And mention a late Professor Yehuda Elkanah, who was a historian and philosopher in Tel Aviv University, who wrote a very famous piece back in the 80s. It was an op-ed under the title of B'zchut hashikhacha, or In the Name of Forgetting. For him, and he was a Holocaust survivor himself, justice really required not only not to, actively to forget and to encourage forgetting in order to get over the Holocaust and start anew. And maybe the tragedy that the books point to is the tragedy of a kind of over-memorialization that in the end, ultimately turns into a kind of political battle about the meaning of that memory, but forgetting is not a possibility. I'll leave it there.